Hi everybody, we're the teaching team from Myth. You might know us from past Screenside Chats, but we thought we'd go around and introduce ourselves again. I'm Peter Struck.
Caroline Whitbeck. Carrie Mowbray. And Kat Gillespie.
Good to see you all again in this format. Last time we talked to you was a few weeks ago. Since then, a lot of stuff has happened. We had a hurricane blast through the east coast of the United States, which is kind of exciting. We heard from some of you out there who had major issues dealing with the hurricane. We understand that. We did too. So we made some extensions and deadlines and those kind of things. And hopefully everyone now who was affected by that storm, which is not a small amount of our student body out there, has pieced everything back together. I know there's still some places around New York that don't have power. These things do happen, and there could be our brethren around the world that are saying to us, my gosh, you folks on the east coast of the United States had to go without power a few days in a row. Well, guess what? In my country, we do all the time. I don't know. It's a complex world out there, and we all deal with issues that come up. And I'm glad that we're showing our resilience, and we are polytropos. We are being resourceful in getting through all the issues that come up. In that line, we have had our first experience with peer grading of our writing assignments. A couple of things I wanted to say about how that was going. Number one is please do continue to do what you've been doing on the forums. It's extremely helpful for us to hear your unvarnished views on how these things have gone for you. And we expect that there'll be some folks whose patience is tested in this process, and we're glad to know when that's happening. More information from you is better than less information, so we're very glad to have all of it, including also the many people who've written in talking about the positive things that they've had from these writing assignments, and that's helpful for us too. So a simple register of how these things are settling with you is good. A more detailed reaction that gives us feedback and constructive criticism that we can use going forward, that's even better. And as always, I think in 99% of the cases that I was following, we've been following the boards very closely, we have maintained and fallen back on the kind of civility that has been a crucial part of this learning environment. And I just want to say thank you for maintaining that. And for those of you who couldn't maintain it, I think you heard more from your fellow Courserians than from any of us as to what the normalized kind of civil discourse is all about, and that's a great thing. I think that this what we're learning from this large unwieldy system is that most of us out there really just want to learn this stuff and do better by it, and that's surely true of your teaching team. So we're doing everything we can, and we're learning a lot as we go. We thank you very much for your patience and especially your constructive engagement in what we're up to. A couple of other house cleaning things to kind of keep an eye on. You've got another writing assignment coming up. That will unfold according to the same format as this one unfolded. There'll be a sneak peek preview of the questions that comes out midweek next week, posted on the forum, so you'll be able to see what the questions are. The writing assignment will go live. It's not this upcoming Sunday, but the following. Well, I don't want to make reference to Sundays that not know exactly when this is going to happen. At the beginning of week 9, very beginning of week 9, the next assignment will become public, but we'll make a queuing up of what that assignment is by giving you the questions in advance the week before, in the middle of the week. Also, there's been some question on the boards as to, when we get to the end of all this, which is kind of sad for us to think about, but when we get to the end of all this, what happens to the course? Does it stay open? The short answer there is, yeah, it will stay open for some amount of time. What we're saying right now is that at the close of the calendar year, we're going to roll things up and turn off the switch. Your comments, all the work that you've been doing on the forum, at least you should probably know, we are going to learn from and continue to learn from even after that date. So it's not as though it disappears, it doesn't go away, but that's at the time when we will be closing up the courses at the close of the calendar year. So that's all I have for announcements, and I think I'll turn it over to our teaching team, other fellow members, to get started on what our discussion for this last couple of weeks has been.
Great. Well, I think I'll start just to kind of remind ourselves of where we've been in these past few weeks and where we're going. Since our last Screenside Chat, we had all of Hesiod, we had the Homeric hymns, we've focused on Demeter and Apollo, and some of the things that came out of those 2 weeks were an emphasis on genealogies, on etiologies, on different renditions or different forms of these myths. Did Odysseus have other children with Circe, etc.? What are the other versions of these myths, and how do we reconcile those? So some of those themes that we're going to see again, especially in tragedy, where we're trying to bring in a lot of these different families and different stories that will come up again and again. Other things that we learned in those 2 weeks, we got 2 new tools, right? We got the tool of Freud to look at some of these myths, and we got the tool of myth and ritual and Jane Harrison and the Cambridge School. So we have 2 very different and new theoretical tools that we're going to be looking at. And now this week we have moved on to tragedy, which is in some ways very similar and in some ways seems very, very different, I think, from what we've been reading thus far. It has a different meter, it has a different context, it has all of these staging concerns that I think a lot of the students have been bringing up. And before we do some of our specific kind of comments on imagery, etc. in Aeschylus, I wanted to remind ourselves, or remind kind of our students, that we are still in a festival context. We're still in a ritual context. We're not looking at theater, or we're not looking at Greek drama as something you would do on a Saturday night. We're looking at Greek drama as part of this city Dionysia, part of a civic festival that happens every year in Athens. At the beginning of the sailing season, you're bringing in all of this audience from everywhere around. So it's very much a collective experience. It's part of your civic identity, is going to this festival. So I think keeping that in mind, as a lot of you all are talking about how you're going to stage, or how you imagine these things as being staged, is really powerful to keep in mind. And also how that audience, having been brought together from all over Greece, is being helped along maybe by this chorus, right, which has their place in the orchestra between the audience and the actors on stage. So that is just something I wanted to remind ourselves, is that we are in this ritual context, and we are in a context where you're defining tragedy as the mimesis of an action, right? So we're not necessarily in the world of narrative as much anymore, but according to Aristotle in the Poetics, we are talking about the mimesis, or the imitation of an action that is whole, complete, and of magnitude, right? So we have this new idea of what the purpose is of these texts. And some of the things that you all have been bringing up on the forums are these ideas of pity and fear, these emotions that the audience is supposed to feel, or that are in some way embedded in these texts. And through those emotions, we are going to experience a catharsis. And we're going to talk a lot about catharsis.
Mm-hmm.
So look forward to that. But those are 2 kinds of ideas that I just want to remind ourselves, that we are in a festival context, and that we are imitating an action rather than just telling a narrative. Even though a lot of that action might happen behind closed doors or behind that central door, keep in mind that is the definition. So that's kind of where I wanted to remind ourselves of where we've come. And now I think we have particular concerns about these plays.
What are, with respect to catharsis, I had some things to kind of jump in with. Shall I do that now, or should we wait till... I had a couple of ideas. In this, some of you all on the boards are really just going steadily at this question of tragedy, and especially the Aristotelian ideas behind it. The idea of catharsis is particularly interesting. This term in Greek has been translated in English in a kind of standard way as being understood as a kind of expulsion of something, a catharsis. You get rid of it, and therefore you no longer have the need you expunge some kind of sense of fear or pity. It goes away, gets out of. But the translation of the Greek term is actually probably much better rendered by a different English term altogether, the idea of purification. What Aristotle's talking about is being put through strenuous emotional experiences such that you refine your sense of pity and your sense of fear, so that you're really good at pitying the things that you should pity and fearing the things that you should fear. Many of us think of our emotional responses as being our natural responses to stuff that happens around us, but there could be a way, we talked about this a little bit with respect to in the Odyssey, there could be a way in which what's happening here is, what Aristotle's imagining is that through this intense experience of of seeing this compressed human action and human emotion, you and I as witnesses have a purification that happens so that we become more refined in our emotional reactions to the things around us. It's a way of making things that make us count as being deeply human, our emotions, especially ones like pity and like fear we share with other animals, but pity we probably don't, and making those emotions that we have be more attuned and finely attuned. Using them makes them better. And this kind of strenuous use, like an athlete testing his or her body, makes a person's emotional responses better and more refined.
Yeah, and linking that back to the festival context, you're also not doing this behind closed doors. You're doing this with your fellow civic body, experiencing these emotions and this catharsis in the context of other spectators, you watching them watching you, you watching what's on stage, watching them watching what's on stage. And so that all plays into this idea of catharsis as well, this refinement and purification of the emotions that you're feeling at some level of remove because they're not actually happening to you personally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And expanding this concern for the audience and the experience of engaging with these tragedies, a couple of you have asked about the translation we're using. We're using the Lattimore editions. And yes, this is very dense poetry. I think Leela Marie had suggested, and a couple were brave enough to say it was hard, and it is very dense, very, a lot of imagery, very formalized language. It doesn't just kind of, it's not a page turner. And I think Anonymous had suggested perhaps the Ted Hughes translation, which I personally have also worked with. And thinking about, refining one's emotional responses by considering various emotional engagements with works. If any of you are interested, perhaps as sort of a provocation, try comparing, get through the Lattimore, give it a try, and look at the Hughes. It's very readable, and there's a lot to recommend about it, but what I was struck when I read it by, and this ties into what some of you have said about certain characterizations, certain actions, particularly Iphigenia, we're going to talk about in a little bit. There are definite liberties that are being taken with characterizations that accord with the modernization of a lot of the sort of language, and it's a modernization of the thematic elements. You see, I would say, a very different characterization of the choices being made, of the language being used. So, give a try. Read some different translations. We're well aware that you're reading a variety of translations because of your different needs. But if something does interest you, if it you want to give it more thought, look at the different versions and try to think hard about the choices that were made. In particular, I just flagged this one because this became an issue for some discussion. I think it's Lattimore is worth wrestling with. It's but Hughes is worth reading for that interest. Why is it that this characterization is so different?
Yeah, and some triangulation back to the Greek will probably be necessary for those. So for those of you out there who already know your Greek, yeah, and there are plenty of you that do, are schooled on ancient Greek, just weigh in and let us know your own views on how these different translators are handling the tragedies. I think Aeschylus's play in particular is something that can be made more readable via a translator's decision to make certain kinds of judgments on what the Greek is saying. Aeschylus in Greek is really tough. And that's true for graduate students, for our best students here at Penn. It's really tough. It's not as though you just kind of waltz into it and breeze right through it. It's hard. And some of that, I think, hardness for those of us working in the ancient Greek is a kind of austere, somewhat impenetrable style that he has. It's oracular. It makes pronouncements, and you're trying to piece those together as you read it. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that I have a final judgment that one is more faithful to the Greek than the other because it's harder. I don't mean that. I just mean that we need to keep all these pieces in the mix for any judgments of translations we're going to make. As a teaching team, we thought that the Lattimore Green translation was the best one for what we were doing. But just as Caroline's saying, bring your other translations and bring them to bear, and let's see. Let's crowdsource it. Let's see what they can help us get back to.
So, one of you had a question. Here again, we talk about colors. Wondering about this tapestry, this robe that Agamemnon is or is not treading on at first. Of course, finally he does. And a couple of you were wondering if it was red, if it was purple, and if there are any other places where we see these colors that are brought to bear. And one place in particular is, this is the same word that we've seen in the Iliad and in the Odyssey, and especially with Helen's own tapestry. So the dye is not a really sort of bright red color. It's actually a deep purple color. It's made from that same purple dye from the seashell, the murex. It's porphyrios. And here we see Agamemnon sort of hesitating, Clytemnestra urging him to do this, and then there's this whole display from Clytemnestra talking about the sea that is ever renewing, that can't be drained of this abundant purple that we have. So this is very fertile ground for interpretation. And we're not sort of imposing it has to be this interpretation or that interpretation, but just to kind of get into what the Greek is saying. That literally he's being challenged or urged or persuaded to walk on a purple-strewn path. So that's what the Greek says there.
And that claim that the linkage between the sea and purification she's making there, but what's really happening as she's laying out this purple crimson path is there's this roughly blood-colored, coagulated blood-colored garment that she's insisting that he walk on, persuading him to walk on it. Well, he doesn't need too much persuasion. He walks on it, and that is his doom. So the cleansing, purifying sea, she's imagining that this continuation of the crimes of hubris that he commits, this overstepping, transgressive kind of crimes that he commits, the continuation of them is leading her to a moment of great purification, where she will root out this evil from her family by killing him, thinking that would do it. Never quite does in this family.
Just like the sea is ever renewing, so are those cycles of blood, guilt, and in Greek tragedy, they keep the engine going.
Yeah.
And one of our students actually noted that the murex shell that was the source of this dye, there's a whole weaving contingent talking about working with this actual item in these dyes, that it's notoriously hard to fix, such that there's the possibility, and again this ties into the imaginative staging that you're all doing that's so interesting on trying to get a fix on the scene, there's the possibility that it could have been imprinting on Agamemnon's feet. Granted, when you've got a giant stadium, who maybe not everyone could see that, but I love the impulse to look for that sort of that cue and that potential in that object as well.
Wow. Well, I'd like to kind of go back from that crimson cloth and kind of talk about the origins of what. Roll it back. But we were talking a little bit, and you all have added a lot of these different staging interpretations of of Peter Hall's National Theatre of London presentation and of the Theatre of Epidaurus of that presentation. There is another presentation where that cloth is actually made out of baby dresses that are dyed red, which is
well done.
Right. Yeah. So some of you were bringing up how much are we supposed to be sympathetic towards Agamemnon, if at all. In this version, I would tend toward 0%. We're not sympathetic towards him at all, but it's a good reminder to go back to where we're coming from, right? That this is Clytemnestra's response to that original murder of her daughter, Iphigenia. And I wanted to touch a little bit upon that occasion and how that gets touched upon in our text. I know that the choruses in particular in our translation are very difficult, but if we look back at that, one of those first choral passages where we get the story of how Agamemnon made that decision to sacrifice his daughter. And we remind ourselves that it was a decision that he made, that our chorus seems to emphasize that it was a difficult decision. But in the end, that Agamemnon, as he says, put on the yoke of necessity. Right, he put on this yoke that we've been talking about as an image of always marriage, right? It has a lot of imagery that has to do with being a yoked pair, that Agamemnon and Menelaus go as the yoked pair of leaders to Troy, that he comes back and his yoke of marriage has kind of fallen apart. Let's say he's become untethered, but he puts on this yoke of necessity in order to sacrifice his daughter. He kills her, and some of you brought up, I think Cassandra Langley brought up how that sacrifice actually looked, and in that thread we got references to later Euripidean plays where we see that Iphigenia was not offered herself to be sacrificed and then was saved, and was substituted by Artemis, the goddess, for an actual deer, and she gets sent away as instead of being killed. So we get these other versions, more versions, where she's actually not killed, but we get in the Agamemnon that there is a decision, that it's a necessity for him to lead the Greek fleet, that he chooses his leadership responsibilities over family in that moment, but that it is a decision, and it's a hard decision to make. A lot of those anxieties that some of you started to bring out since we've been reading the hymns, and all about kind of female transitions, this connection between marriage and death, perhaps. Here we get the denial of Iphigenia. She doesn't get, instead of getting married, she expects that she's going to get married when she goes to see her father. Instead of getting married, she actually greets death. So we get a lot of these kind of failed transitions that you guys have brought up as reflections, and kind of building on this Persephone myth, or this idea of the Kore, who doesn't get married but who goes down to wed either Hades himself or a metaphorical death. So that's kind of the background, but knowing that background kind of helps us see if we're going to see Agamemnon sympathetically or not. And all of these versions that you all have been pointing to really guide the audience towards how we're supposed to view him and his wife. So that's just one of those backgrounds that I wanted to make sure we had in our pocket of myth.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and tying into that idea of, how do we see Agamemnon? How do we see this decision? I think some of the students were asking about, in particular, the imagery of the hair, which is definitely a part of that scene and that decision. In our edition, on page 9, Artemis is pitying the hare, angered with pity at the flying hounds of her father eating the unborn young in the hair. And these flying hounds are the two eagles that I think we can read as being Menelaus and Agamemnon, about to, taking this yoke of necessity, and they're continuing on the war and making this aggressive stance. But interestingly enough, if you want to consider the way that this choice is negotiated and these positions are negotiated, a few pages earlier on page 6, the exact same imagery occurs. It's again the eagles. The eagles stricken now in agony, as for the young perished high from the nest. So I think you can even see, even in the very early in this chorus song, the negotiation of the positions of the victims and the victimized and the victimizers, and the fact that it shifts positions, perhaps suggesting that there are these possibilities for things not necessarily being otherwise, but for a certain complexity in the moral position, if we want to call it that.
Yeah, there can't be any easy call in this family.
Right.
There can't be. Otherwise, the drama that holds it all together, the tension that makes it work, would be very lax. It's not a simple call in any of these cases as to what the right thing to do is.
Right. And I think a lot, aside from the hair, we've also brought up kind of this lion imagery, right?
Yes.
That you should be, the man of the house should be the lion in warfare, right? And then you have Clytemnestra being kind of a lion-hearted woman, and then you have the metaphor of if you raise a lion cub in your house, whether we want to read that as clearly referring to Orestes, who is of course going to be the next cycle of vengeance, or read it in another way. I think it's really valuable that you all have brought up that particular animal imagery as well, in addition to the hare and the eagles.
There are a lot of great considerations of that. Is it Aegisthus, who was taken in by the house of Atreus, who's now sort of turned on them, much in the way that Helen, in that particular example. Also, some of you very smartly noted that, yes, we've seen this as being the Orestian model very earlier with Odysseus. is the ravaging lion as he's laying waste to all of his suitors. So, yeah, very good close reading on all of these details. And, in something that is this rich and this dense, you want to pay attention for those poetic moments that offer you that sort of window of clarity into these very dense moments.
And just going back to birds really quickly, one of the final scenes, the scene with Cassandra, which is one of my favorite personally in all of tragedy. So Cassandra is compared to a bird, and then she sort of, by the chorus, and then she sort of takes on and interprets that and talks about the song of sorrow that she sings, and she says, "Oh, if only I could just be a nightingale singing about sorrow." So she's sort of she doesn't have the same fate as just being sort of an innocuous or innocent bird. Look closely at the animal imagery that she also speaks when she starts prophesying and seeing her seeing into the house of Atreus. So she talks about keeping the bull from his mate, and that's just a very powerful scene. So not only are there birds and lions, we have bulls, and it's just a whole
yoke of necessity.
It's a whole zoo when we talk about Agamemnon and company.
And I'm always tempted when we talk about the closeness between humans and animals to reflect back on the sacrifice theme. It surely comes up in the Oresteia as each of these cycles of vengeance is framed in ways that cuts both ways. It's a medicine that actually kills, doesn't cure. It's a attempt at purification that actually pollutes. And oftentimes it's an attempt at sacrifice, which is a perversion of sacrifice. Rather than appeasing gods, it unleashes the furies. So...
I might add one other moment that looking ahead to more tragedy, that if you, like I'm sometimes horrified at some of the things that are either happening behind closed doors or that are talked about, sometimes even the chorus will say, "Would that we were birds and could fly away," thus that we didn't have to witness what is going on in this household. So if you've been a little disturbed by any of this, you're not alone, and you are in good company. So that would be my one other image for us to look at as we move on in tragedy.
And I'd like to say this is the worst of it, but it probably isn't. It gets a little worse from here. And then maybe it gets better, I don't know. But we are in this world, we framed it at the beginning. I mean, we're going to see people doing amazing things. We're also going to see human beings doing horrible, inhuman things, and each of these, taking a cue from Aristotle, is helping us refine our own sense of what it is that we admire, what it is that we detest, and we need to know those two things so we can allocate our pity and fear according to the way that we should. It's not an easy thing. We need to do it through experience and through our own refinement of our own capacities to engage in these deeply human emotions. And with that, it's been a great time to talk to you all, and we look forward to the next Screenside Chat. Happy reading. I hope that you're enjoying the reading as much as it's very apparent. It's apparent to us that you are on the forum, and we're looking forward to hearing more from you all as you carry on with your reading. Tragedy gives us a wonderfully dense structure to work with. The number of words are many fewer than we show in Homer, but it's likely that each one of them is it's extremely dense. So look forward to the next time we have a chance to talk. So long.